the perception of atheists was that we were this outside entity of belligerents that were just hell bent on bringing down the school district. And
check. You're up.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to episode 2 of A Christian and an Atheist Walk Into a Bar. I am your atheist, Satan-worshipping host, Jay Stooksbury, and with me is my Christian, science-denying co-host, Ty Gallenbeck.
That's right. I love how you say good evening when the odds of someone listening to this at any specific time frame is completely...
I always wondered how you start that off because, people listen to this in an asynchronous nature, so I listen to a lot of podcasts at the evening, so I just assume everyone's like me.
All right. At least
the good people out there.
You've got a motive behind it all. So here we go, episode 2. Hopefully we're trying to figure out how all this stuff works. And man, if you're listening to the second episode of this, welcome back.
And you're a sucker for torture.
That's right. So I think Jay was going to do a little shout out here. When we started this, we started looking for websites and, all the things that you do in today's modern culture before you launch something. And we actually stumbled across a book. And I'll just let you take over, Jay.
Yeah, actually, I think we did the backwards motion. We actually started off with what we wanted it to be named right from the get-go. And we didn't really do our research if there was another brand out there or anything like that. And we went ahead and bought all the domain rights. And we started securing Twitter handles and Facebook accounts and Instagram. And then I just was like, I was thinking about imagery, what we want to do for branding for a logo. And I was like, there's got to be something out there with like an image of like the Christian fish or the Darwin fish, with beer mugs and things of that nature. So I just did a Google search on atheist and Christian, and lo and behold, there is a book titled "An Atheist and a Christian Walk Into a Bar." So it was
completely
the opposite,
different,
totally different,
not remotely the same.
Yeah. So we still had a hesitation of like, well, we don't want to get sued, so maybe we better do a little more due diligence. So we actually reached out to the authors of this book, and the full title of the book is "An Atheist and a Christian Walk Into a Bar," talking about God, the universe, and everything, by Randall Rouser and Justin Schreiber, which hopefully I pronounced those names correctly. And we just sent them an email, and they responded really quickly. It was actually instantly, and they gave us the thumbs up. They said, "Hey, you can't copyright a book title, so there we go. We can't have any legal claims unless this is a trap where they're just planning on suing us as soon as we publish this on their website." But they were really good folks, and I wanted to make sure that we mentioned their names. And they said that if we ever get to a point where we're actually good enough technologically at this, that we can interview them too on an episode, which we'd be more than happy to do too. So if you guys are actually listening to that, guys, thanks again. And we're still trying to figure out how microphones work. So give us some time on how to figure out telephones too. So
that's right. But it was really cool. So if you are doing Google searches or whatever, and you come across this book, Jay and I were both just saying that we're going to order a copy so we can give an actual review of what we think on this book.
Yeah, might actually be an episode right there.
There you go.
Yeah.
We could give our own discourse on it.
Mm-hmm.
So we alluded to this last week in our initial episode called Genesis, which I'm not sure how I got title stakes to the first episode, but we went with that, of how we started this whole process of how you and I ended up in your bar talking about Christian atheism, interactions, and how that all looks and where that came from. So episode 1, was kind of a background story. Episode 2, we're actually going to dive into that initial story a little more and take a look at kind of what sparked this and maybe what we can learn from it, takeaways as we've seen people interact with this situation, a community as a whole in a lot of ways react to this one specific situation, and just give some thoughts and how we think what went well, what didn't go well, what needs to be addressed, what is completely ridiculous that's getting thrown out there, all of those kind of things.
And I think it's important too, as we alluded to before, that the incident that we're talking about actually does involve a lawsuit too. So, in our best effort to be fair and objective about how this is presented, we're going to do our best not to insert ourselves in any of the hearsay or the gossip or anything that's not public record, because it's just not the right thing to do, and that's not really what we're about either too. So we want to make sure that we're let you guys know that we're trying our best to present this in the most objective way possible, so that it's the lessons that we're taking away from it aren't tainted because of that.
Absolutely. I mean, there will be some small town influence biases that I'm sure will unavoidably come across. But do know we are trying to take a step back to separate ourselves from this situation, from being personally involved, and just look at it as how can we as individuals deal with these situations as they come up better? How can we, for me and Jade, I'm sure, communicate with adolescents and teens and youth that deal with these situations, and then also parents and everybody else in a community, how can we get better as a whole when these kind of situations arise? So the situation that we're talking about, how about you give a little background, where it started, those kind of things, and kind of where we're at now?
Sure. So and again, this is my understanding of everything and the trajectory of it, is this all started with at our middle school. This is kind of the ground zero for the conflicts that were to come. A middle school student was basically came to his or her mom, I don't remember the gender of the student, I don't think it's really important, to say that they felt that they were being mistreated at the school, based off of an incident where they were in a library, in the middle school library, leaving the library, and at some point, I don't know if it was a teacher or a librarian or some adult figure, suggested that if the students wanted to, there were small little Gideon Bibles available for them to take. And this one particular student did not take one of the Gideon Bibles, and claimed that they were being ridiculed after leaving the classroom, just based off of that choice. Now, I don't know what conversations took place between the parents of that child and the school district. At some point, though, a outside organization that basically represents atheist, secular, freethinker type folks got involved to approach the school district about what they alleged was bullying and religious-based bullying, and trying to get the school district to respond about what they were doing to address this situation. And long story short, I mean, there's a lot of layers to this. The introduction of this outside atheist group inspired other students to come forward with their own stories about feeling mistreated by the school district, and specifically based off of some type of religious experience. And one of those students, which should we go ahead and say his name too? Everything's public record.
Exactly.
One of these students was named Cidney Fisk. and she came forward to the organization to talk about her own experience at the high school, so not at the middle school, different school, and about some experiences that she had that she felt that she was being mistreated for, I don't know necessarily some of the details, but the claims of the lawsuit is that her First Amendment rights were being violated, about her ability to demonstrate her beliefs. She felt like she was being unfairly targeted by teachers and counselors, and she alleged it's a lot of stuff in the lawsuit. And I think actually, if we want to, we probably could just include a link to the lawsuit because it's a pretty lengthy read.
Yeah, we can include. We'll try to get a link for the actual lawsuit. There's also a Denver Post article about it that has some of the allegations and things like that in it as well.
Mm-hmm. And another element to the story too is that once this outside atheist group got involved, they came forward and they started asking the school district, and how are you going to address this? And one of the kind of piecemeal solutions that came forward is based off of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. If you are going to have one religion represented, then you're going to have all of them represented. So the atheist group actually inspired the school to allow for one day to allow satanic literature and atheist literature to be available for students to pick up and for them to handle. And it was actually, I think it was throughout the school district. So it was I think we have 4 high schools in our county here, and they made sure that all this literature was available at all these different high schools.
Which I have no idea if this literature actually ended up in any of the schools. I don't know for sure.
I think they did.
Okay.
Yeah. I know they did for sure at the local one here
In Delta.
Yeah.
Oh,
and
yeah,
and
we're
I
from there.
Yeah. And so and I'm pretty sure that they made an effort to go to the other ones, but either way, what I know what they had to offer was, it was like a satanic coloring book.
Oh, that went to the elementary schools. I did.
Oh, did? Okay.
Yes, I do know that.
Yeah, and apparently those were like hotcakes. Like those were picked up right away.
My wife actually tried to pick one of those up just because she wanted a souvenir.
Yeah.
And they were already gone.
My wife was actually telling me to go to the school to pick one up, and I'm not in the school district. And then they also had just literature about atheism. It wasn't a coloring book, so it wasn't as cool as the satanic people, but
right.
So that was the one piecemeal solution. So, but even outside of that, though, the story of Cidney Fisk prevailed, and it became a really prominent conversation with our community too. And like I said, there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of rumors involved, and we're not going to get into any of that because it's just not the fair thing to do. But it does present a good starting off point for some conversation about, first off, could this situation have been handled differently?
Right.
And not just from Cidney's perspective, but also the school district's perspective as well, too.
So I do want to read, just to show kind of an impact. I did just a Google search on this. Just some of the headlines that have surrounded this. We have said we're from a small community here, and so anything that garnishes headlines is big news. But some of them include Colorado school bans, quote, inappropriate, unquote, atheist satanic literature. Atheist and satanic literature to be distributed in schools. Pamphlets, this is my favorite, pamphlets by atheists tempt Delta students. Very tempting.
They didn't say tempt to what.
Who knows? What it's like to be a student with a brain in Delta County. That's actually one of the blogs from Cidney. Western Colorado. Oh, not that one. We don't need to read that one. Colorado student sues her old school district for anti-atheist. On and on and on. There's pages of this. It's big news for our community. In other places, I'm sure on the coast, everybody's like, wait, this is still an issue?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in small town, rural America, it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and yeah, it's we were talking before the show started too. Is that the conversation about separation of church and state is not something that's new. It's something that has been widely debated since the founding of our country too. Um, and I don't imagine it's ever really going away either. But at the same point, it does uh, become topical for these types of situations, and I think it's a something that's worthwhile of conversation too.
Absolutely. And I think the big thing is separation in church and state exist. It is not a question mark. It is not something that's up for debate. That is there. So when these situations arise, in this case, how could it have been handled better? How do
Mm-hmm.
we avoid the drama that it created in
Mm-hmm.
this kind of community? How do we learn and grow and move forward?
Mm-hmm.
Those kind of things from this specific situation for
Mm-hmm.
us.
Yeah, and what's funny too is that this the bulk of a lot of these headlines that came out that was about 2 years ago, and that was right after I mean, it was like we said before, the dialogue was ugly. The headlines were as clickbaitish and as as scary as they sounded, and that's what inspired a lot of that kind of negativity, and that's what brought Ty and myself together into that bar to really to sit down and be like, man, what do we have to do? And part of my influence of it too is that um, the perception of atheists was that we were this outside entity of belligerents that were just hell bent on bringing down the school district, and a lot of the people that are part of this organization, actually, I think all of them don't live in our town at all.
Right.
So there's that you know carpetbagger sort of persona that they carried too. So these darn outsiders are coming into our town to screw our school system. And so right away it's like, whoa, I'm over here, the lone atheist in the crowd. Be like, no, we're not all like that. I don't want to school. I don't want to sue the school district. And that's why I felt to be a little bit more outspoken about being an atheist and being in this community as well too, and being equally vested. And not to necessarily like belittle either side of the conversation, but to also remind people that there are unhealthy caricatures that are being thrown about on social media and day-to-day conversation that are not productive, and they don't really characterize what the real conversation is about.
Right. I think I made a reference at one point that this atheist group, not as extreme by any means, but has some similarities with like the Westboro Baptist Church
Right.
and how they misrepresent more than they do represent. It's a small minority the way this group
Mm-hmm.
chooses to handle things. I think
Mm-hmm.
we'd both agree with that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, they came in, and to watch this unfold was watching daytime drama TV. As far as
But like way
message
worse.
boards, oh man, message boards, students, parents, how I could not understand. Like when my wife is a teacher, and when this all erupted and the school district decided that they were going to allow this atheist and satanic literature in the schools, one of the first reactions from a majority of the Christian parents was, well, my kid's not going to go to school that day.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife and I were just laughing, like, this is hysterical. Like, how does that solve anything?
Mm-hmm.
And number one, it doesn't. But then number two, okay, so you and your child are Christians, and that's what you believe. So going to school on one day where there's some literature there is going to infect you. Like
Mm-hmm.
we just didn't understand the thinking process behind this.
Mhm.
And so, and I think that happened on both sides.
Mhm.
You know, throwing lawsuits. I know the atheist group did like a pizza party after
Mhm.
school one day.
Right.
Like these are all things that have, it just turned into this circus.
Yeah, it was a definite sideshow.
Which we're 2 years out, I
Mhm.
think is what we are now, at least a year out from when this all took place. And I think if you asked around this community, has anything really changed?
Mhm.
It's going to be minor.
Right.
At least that's my perception.
Right. Well, I mean, the world ended that day that the satanic coloring books were handed out. I mean, that's an empirical fact, obviously.
Yes.
And I think that was there was a lot.
Or Jesus came back on that same day.
Yeah,
it was one or the other.
I missed it, man.
We're both still sitting here.
Yeah, I know. Maybe he was grabbing all the satanic coloring books. And that's why they were all gone.
Dang it.
Jesus. So, so I digress from Jesus. Yeah, I think the nothing really changed in terms of how we still interacted with each other, and it's still, when the lawsuit finally became official, it almost kind of felt like that same conversation just picked up right off. You know, I think some attitudes might have changed a little bit, but the negativity just, like, it didn't skip a beat either, you know?
Right.
So there was a lot of stuff going around on social media again, specifically about it. And again, it's still missing the point of what we're trying to do in terms of treating each other civilly and having good conversations about, as we've alluded to before, about how we better handle these types of conflicts. So, you know, and one thing that I always have kind of an interesting thought about too, and it's something I get asked about a lot too, is as a parent, what's my role in shaping the religious identity of my son? You know, and I think there is a lot of that type of experience in our school district, in this particular situation that you saw, is that everything that happened involved an overbearing parent of some nature and a student of some nature as well,
Right.
too.
On both sides.
On both sides, yeah, absolutely. And you know, I think about, I'm not raising my son to become an atheist. You know, I think it's really important that whatever decision that he comes about, he does at his own pace, that he arrives on his own agency, and he does so after his own search, like the search that I was allowed to have, like Ty was allowed to have. And what that end result will look like, it's not really for me to say either. And at the same point too, I also understand how defensive parents can be about protecting our kids as well too, from what they might seem or perceive to be some sort of negative influence too. So, you know, like I alluded to in the intro, there's a weird connection between atheists and Satan worshiping. And it's weird because there is an actual element within the Satanist community, and I can't remember which one it is, but there is an atheist element to the Satan, you know, believers and followers. But at the same point too, like there's this weird notion too that we sacrifice animals,
Right.
and you know, all those kind of false caricatures. But you know, and I don't really necessarily know where I'm going with this either. But I think it's important that whenever we're getting into these notions of how we're presenting religion to our kids, that we need to realize too that they are going to be introduced to a lot of different ideas outside of our influence, whether we want to or not.
Absolutely.
Now, does that necessarily have to happen in a school environment? I don't know. I don't. But I do think that if you are going to be, if you are going to have it, you have to have it all. You know, establishment clause is pretty straightforward. You can't establish one specific religion in a public institution to represent what religion's about. So
Absolutely.
so if you're going to teach the Bible, you got to teach the Quran, and you got to teach everything that you probably are opening up that can of worms that you're not realizing too, from the get-go.
Exactly. Yeah, I had a couple of conversations with parents on the Christian side of things about when all this unfolded, that you have to, if you're going to allow one, you have to allow all of them. And my stance has been, well, if you actually believe that what you believe is truth, then as someone goes through it, they'll be able to weed stuff out. And so it shouldn't cause this giant catastrophe that the world is ending when this kind of stuff happens. So all that. So let's do this. As you were talking, this is what I was thinking about. So you alluded last time to the fact that when you were in high school, you were more of a rebellious, bad religion t-shirt wearing punk rocker.
Yeah.
So let's take it back in time. If you were in this situation and you were Cidney Fisk and you felt this wrong, how do you see yourself going about handling this situation?
It's a great question, because it's actually something that I really try to think about when I try to view this particular topic too, because as I said last episode too, how 35-year-old Jay views something is drastically different than how 15-year-old Jay views something. And I think 15-year-old Jay, because I went to a really large public school, and had that same sort of rebellious spirit as you alluded to as well too, and but definitely a chip on my shoulder. So if I felt that I was being wronged, especially as someone who was very vocal about his atheism, if I felt like a teacher was trying to, shove the Bible down my throat or something like that, I would probably be upset, and I'd probably I don't know exactly how I would do it, honestly. I really don't. Because there's conflicting parts of this as well too, because not only would I want to, stir the pot and try to fight the man and bring down the school system or anything like that. My mom was also a teacher at my high school too, so I had to walk a fine line about how I handled that sort of thing. So one of the things I always appreciate about my parents, though, is that they saw that I had that side, and they were really good about channeling it into like more productive things. So that's how I got into writing. I was editor of my newspaper. They really encouraged me to participate in some of the different school-based, like basically just school board, internal school board decision-making process, where they actually had a seat that was specifically dedicated for students that I joined. So I was actually be able to provide input on school curriculum and things like that. So yeah, I don't know necessarily if I would go the lawsuit route at that age. I don't even necessarily think that would be something. And again, this is me just projecting my own insecurities at that age as well too. But I definitely would understand the mentality of a young person who was passionate about something, who had strong beliefs, and felt wronged by an authority figure, because you are supposed to trust adults, right? And the second that they break that trust, that's kind of a sacred bond that's gone out the window too. And to be quite honest with you, I don't know if I really know the full answer to that, but I definitely would probably lash out in some way. I would probably have, I don't know what that outburst would look like, whether it's, a strongly worded letter to the editor or something like that, or me trying to approach our principal in a very aggressive way. But I do get that there is a when you're kind of young and impulsive, there is a temper that's really easily triggered for these types of situations. So,
Right.
and now 35-year-old me, who also worked with 15-year-old versions of myself when I was working in youth development, also knows that I had to take those lessons of what made me mad and what was the best way to handle that anger and channeling into something more productive, whether it was helping kids find writing or music or sports or something to help channel that aggression. Because sometimes if it's there are ways of channeling it I hate to quote uh, lyrics, but Rage Against the Machine always said it best: "Anger is a gift." If you just have to use it correctly. So if you, because anger is not necessarily anything bad. It's just passion, and it's passion about an injustice that you feel like needs to be righted. A wrong that needs to be righted. So yeah, and it's something that definitely shapes the way I look at this, because then it makes me conflicted,
Right.
because there's a part of you that nobody wants a school district sued. We're taxpayers, and we know what that means. And it's just also, we know that we're in terms of our particular school district, we're not the most affluent school district either, too. So a lawsuit presents a pretty big financial challenge for our particular community. But at the same point, too, you don't want kids to feel like they've been bullied or cornered, or you don't want them to feel like they've been persecuted for their beliefs. And it's that balancing act that we have to be, carefully walk. And like we said too, there's a lot that needs to be talked about on our school district side and how they handle these types of things.
Absolutely.
So to kind of throw it back in your direction, then, I know one of the things that took place that Cidney referenced was an outside speaker came to the school, and we won't go into the details of it, but this particular speaker had a particular message about, I believe she had some kind of like sex talk involved with it.
It was an abstinence talk.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah, there it is. So, and it didn't necessarily reference religion, but at the very end of the presentation, I think there was like a cross on the last slide of the PowerPoint presentation. I think that's what was kind of that was what is alleged,
Right.
And I think you had a little bit of background on how these types of talks take place, right? Because these are outside speakers that are paid to come to a school, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're paid by the school, right?
Yes. So I know. So I am a performer.
Mm-hmm.
I am a speaker.
Mm-hmm.
I have done these kind of events. I am a Christian, and so separation in church and state exists. You have to be aware of that as you're coming into these situations.
Mm-hmm.
So, from my perspective, how this stuff is done is there is definitely a dance to it. There is a lot of Christian speakers and entertainers who have come up with presentations that are more neutral in order to be able to present in schools, whether it's bullying topics or whatever. Abstinence in this case. There are ways of going about that. Whether that's right or wrong, I think it's completely based on the speaker, because to say that someone who is a Christian cannot be a very talented motivator and speaker when it comes to career choices is ridiculous.
Yeah, agreed.
And so there is ways about this. The specific instance that is being referenced, I know that I actually think there was a much more overt, is that the right word?
Or in your face?
Yes.
Okay, so it wasn't subtle.
No, from what I understand, it
Mhm.
was not a subtle presentation.
Mhm.
The abstinent speaker was pretty obvious about her beliefs and her
Mhm.
stance and why she took these stance.
Well, and abstinence by itself is pretty obvious in terms of
Typically, yes.
what that stance is.
Yeah,
And what that
absolutely.
bias
Yeah.
is.
And so from my understanding, and this is coming from my students who
Mhm.
were in student leadership roles within my organization, that this was presented in a very overt way and presented very poorly for the most part. It has nothing to do with this person. She was not good at her job.
Yeah,
She just
that's what I've heard too.
yeah, this person just did not, and I haven't seen her, I haven't met her. This is purely people in the audience who came to me and said, yeah, it was just bad.
It wasn't even necessarily a content thing. It was just a
No.
presentation thing.
Yeah, this person was not good at public speaking and should not have been presenting this, and that got tied into this person being a Christian and doing other things with that as well. And so,
And one question I have too is that was it voluntary to be at it, or were they
I have
required?
no idea.
Because my understanding, and again, maybe we're getting into the hearsay part of this, is that you had to have permission to join it, or you can opt out of it, basically.
Right.
Which, again, I guess I don't really know.
Well, yeah, I don't. I went to this high school, and I know any assembly that took place in the afternoon, you could opt out very easily by your own choice, whether the administration liked that or not.
Sure.
So
it's just like ditching class, right?
Well, except way easier.
Yeah.
Because everybody, yeah. So I don't know. I would assume, just based on school hours and stuff, that it was probably a required part of the day. I mean, that would be my assumption on this, that because it was a part of a typical school day, that unless you had exemptions to be able to get out of any class during that time frame, this was part of your standard day. Which I think when schools bring in quality speakers, that can be very beneficial.
Sure.
This apparently was not one of them. So, I had a question. Oh, well, man, we are off the wall right now. We're kind of.
It's all right.
We're like a tennis match here, one side than the other. I think where I want to kind of land the plane as we're kind of getting down to this here. So if you, in 5 minutes or less, 35-year-old you, looking at this situation, what's the advice? Because I'll take 2 minutes to say this, but if I was in this situation and I was a student, and the closest I can put myself into Cidney's shoes is, I was in a college class my freshman year where the professor would walk in every day and ask the class, do you believe that Muhammad is the one true prophet? And that's how he opened every class for an entire semester. And for probably the first 2 months of this, it was definitely abrasive. Like, I felt conflicted by it. I felt like it went against my beliefs. I had these emotions. But for me, I'm a very, for the most part, reserved person. If I'm going to be in a conflict, it's going to be mostly passive aggressive. That's my nature. And so to think back to this situation for me, I don't have that personality. This is not remotely how I would handle that situation. And if it happened to me today, I'm much more willing to get into those kind of conflicts because I think I will handle them appropriately and good will come of it. But that could be some false notion I have of myself. But I think the question that would be good to try to answer is, okay, as 35-year-old Jay,
Mm-hmm.
what would you tell Cidney on how to handle this? And then two, 35-year-old Jay, how do you handle this as an atheist in this community from your current standpoint? And then I'll try to answer kind of the same questions.
Okay. Uh, and I don't know necessarily think that I would be able to give good advice to Cidney, just because I think part of the problem with this particular topic is that we have her side of the story, but we don't have the school side of the story because they're being very close, tight-lipped about this, and so it's really hard to have the balanced input of like what actually took place and what the evidence shows. And that's just the atheist side of me. It's like, show me the evidence of what before I can really make a claim.
Right.
But I do think that as 35-year-old Jay would be talking to 15-year-old Jay about how to handle this type of perceived conflict, or not perceived conflict, but perceived oppression, or whatever you want to label it, would be to really encourage him not to, because I think when I would get into the really sanctimonious side of my youth, that I would be really quick to step back away from people. I would be really quick to, escape to my room or escape to whatever made me feel comfortable, which often was something that made me a little bit more antisocial, something that took me away from people, took me away from my parents, it took me away from, and I probably not necessarily all of them, but it took me away from some of my friends as well too, because it made me kind of toxic to be around. So I don't know if people just escaped me just because they didn't want to be around me or not, but I think that.
I'm gonna pause you.
So I would be really quick to step away from people and step away from conversation and not do anything productive. And I had other issues too at this age too, that you can talk about some substance use and things like that. That would probably be the one of the things that takes place. But I think what 35-year-old me would try to encourage 15-year-old me to do would be, just to take that time to center myself for at least a little bit, but then don't let that be the end result either too. Um, think about what the big picture is, and if there is a wrong that needs to be righted, what's the process to do that? And so I think one of the things that I was really passionate about too was a lot about the civic process and what are the steps and how are policies created, how are leaders elected, how are power structures created, and what can you do to address those things. So I think I'd really encourage me to think about, okay, so if you felt like something bad happened at your school, you went to your principal and the principal did nothing, what's your next step? Do you try to find a way to bring up that point again with the principal, or do you go above their head? Do you go to the school board? Where do you go? And
Right.
trying to get you to think about it strategically, I guess, too. But I think the main thing though too is that I'd really encourage young me, not to just shut people out either too, because at that age, if you wronged me, you were dead to me. Like,
Right.
I wouldn't go to talk to you. Like, I would just give you the dirty eye, the side eye the whole way down the hall, and I wouldn't try you to have a conversation, all because there's no point. You're not worth talking to. And I've learned that some of my most productive conversations have taken place with people who I have fundamental disagreements with, on a variety of issues, and it's mostly from a policy standpoint. If I have a disagreement with how something's taking place at our city government, I meet with our mayor and council members for coffee, and I lay it out to them about what I think is wrong, and I start that conversation there about why I think what's going on is wrong, but I also try to get their feedback about where they're coming from too, because there's always at least two sides to a story.
Right.
There's at bare minimum two, but there's most likely like 10, in most situations. And making sure that you have that conversation really grounds you every time. And it makes you less likely to fly off, derail the conversation and get really combative. And unless, you're dealing with someone that can't be reasoned with. But the main thing is the person to person contact, like what we're doing right now. It's really hard to get super aggressive and to really be combative when you're face to face with someone. And again, it just depends on the situation, but for the most part, it makes you have to accept some nuance. It makes you realize that you have to find a middle ground somewhere along the way for this to go forward, because in the end of the day too, you're not king of the world.
Right.
Your way is not how everything has to be. You live with lots of other people with competing interests, and you have to find some way to play ball with all these people. And you can voice your concerns, and you can do your best, and there's a lot of things that help protect minority viewpoints, and I think as long as the other side is willing to sit down and talk, then that conversation should always take place. And where those breakdowns of communication happen is where we get into the kind of the uglier side of what we see on the news.
Right.
Everything from lawsuits to debates in Congress and everything like that. A lot of those issues that if they were really easy, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So yeah, I don't know if I can really say that I would be the best person to react to this type of thing in that same situation as a 15-year-old me, but hopefully that kind of gives you a little perspective, at least how I would approach a younger version of me.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so if 35-year-old me was to talk to 15-year-old me going through something like this, obviously I would not be in the same scenario. But if I had been wronged and I wanted to see change done, I think now knowing what I do, like you said, there are channels and there's a way to go about it. But I think the biggest thing is it in any situation, if you're trying to create change, you have to create an understanding for why this change needs to take place.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not going to happen through name calling. That's not going to happen through bashing. That's not going to happen through brash actions of any kind on either side. I have never seen anyone's mind changed by someone with a picketing sign or with a bullhorn. Like, that does not convince you of anything. And if anything,
it has to be a Facebook post. That's what changes things.
Apparently, in today's day and age, if I get 100 likes, then I've made a difference in the world. No, you have 100 people that think the same way you do.
Right.
You haven't changed anything. But so figuring out, and I think that process probably looks different in every school and every work environment and every place that looks slightly different. But like you alluded to, it starts with conversation. And it starts with trying to take yourself out of the situation and hear someone else's perspective. If the things that were allegedly said in this specific instance were said, then there was people at the wrong. And I will allude to one of them very specifically because I can remember being absolutely appalled at the statement that was made by someone who at the time was serving on, you may know better than I do, the school district board. Is that right?
There's the school board.
Yeah, she was on the school board and was quoted in the paper saying that transgender students should be castrated. This is a Christian person in our community, and I was appalled by this statement. And as soon as all of this started exploding, I had no doubt in my mind that this was going to be something that people came back to. But to latch onto that statement is wrong. That I have no doubt in my mind that statement should not have been said. But me right now saying this on a podcast is going to change nothing. The only way that would ever get changed is to sit down with this person and have that conversation. And who knows if that will ever happen. I'm not that worried about it at this point. I'm not going, to pursue that to that extent. But if I was in a position where I felt like I needed to change something, it would have to start with that. And who knows what I would learn about that statement, and who knows the kind of regrets and feeling that could come with that. I don't know. So 35-year-old me would say start by talking to people and do it in a way where you take yourself out of the equation to start.
And you brought up a point that I wanted to build upon too, because it reminded me of a quote, and of course I'm referencing a Facebook post here. There's an individual named Nicholas J. Sarwark, who is the national chair of the Libertarian Party, who's also a practicing lawyer too. And he had a post today that really, really resonates and I think fits well with this particular conversation too. So he writes, "There are lawyers who think that they can educate potential jurors during jury selection and teach them what the law requires. They are arrogant and wrong. If a random group of people with decades of different life experiences come into a courtroom thinking that a lawyer is going to change their core beliefs is hubris and dangerous to your client. Winning trials is about telling a story that resonates with the values that people already have, not about changing their values. Jurors don't need to be taught. They need to come back with a 2-word verdict. Keep your eye on the goal." So I think the point was not necessarily just a lesson about how to be a good lawyer, but also talking about how you need to at least recognize that there are other people on the other side of the equation with already entrenched values. And the most persuasive way to actually change them is to find that common ground of what values that they are not necessarily empathizing with you, and you're forcing them to empathize with you. So, and that's not going to happen, inside your echo chamber with the people that already agree with you. It's going to happen by actually approaching the person, talking about where you're coming from and knowing where they're coming from, and then also trying to figure out, okay, well, if you believe in free speech or freedom of religion or whatever that core value may be, here's where I feel like you wronged me in that particular topic too. And making them take a step back on their own too might be more impactful on making some sort of effective change too.
Right.
So, but again, that only happens if there's a conversation, and it only happens if you're willing to, like you said, take yourself out of the equation and put yourself into the other people's shoes too.
Yeah. It's never going to happen by being brash or confrontational or any of those things.
No.
Like that is not going to create a solution.
No.
You're just not going to get there. People are going to put up walls and they're going to become defensive, and we all do it. There's no secret to that. But if you actually want to create change in an individual and an entity in a work environment, in anything, you have to, be willing to speak, listen, and operate in a, normal human manner.
Yeah, a civil manner,
Civil. There's a better word.
I think
that's why you're the writer.
I think a good rule of thumb is that, and this is what I always try to challenge myself to be too, because I'm always engaged in all sorts of debate and controversy and things like that. But my goal in any conversation is to always be the calmest voice. Right. And that means that I need to really make sure that I'm careful about the words that I choose. I try to keep it above the belt, not go to the name calling, ad hom type route of conversation. And I try to stick to the facts. I try to stick to my principles. And if that's not enough, then that's a whole other issue. But at the end of the day, though, that people tend to mirror the emotions that you're putting out. So if I'm coming at you, if I walked into this room with my shoulders up and eyes fiery red, you'd think, okay, something's coming up, you know, and I need to prepare myself. I'm probably going to have to, respond in the same manner too. So you put out, you get a lot of what you put out.
Which I think one of the big problems with that is when you create those emotions in someone else, they are no longer thinking logically either.
Right.
So you've actually just put yourself at a hindrance.
Right.
Like you have prevented yourself from being able to have a logical conversation by being confrontational.
Yeah. Agreed.
Well, we're an hour in tonight.
Whoa.
So I think we'll leave that at that. There will be more to come in future episodes. And if we'd love to hear civil conversation about this topic and input if you're actually listening to this. And maybe, who knows, maybe we're lucky enough that there's people listening to this in other communities that have had a different experience with a similar kind of situation.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear how those have played out and maybe, best practices that have worked well. And
or if anything productive came out of it, like really cool podcasts with guys drinking beer and talking civilly about things.
Yeah, if nothing else. Cidney, thank you for creating this podcast. Cheers
to you.
Hey, thanks for listening to episode 2. This is the Christian and Atheist Walk into a Bar,
where we try to bridge the religious divide one beer at a time.
Thanks for listening.